all I wanted.
In Canada, we see diversity as a source of strength, not weakness.
Is to find the answers.
That we are ourselves nations of immigrants, and that diversity is our strength.
To questions a catchphrase couldn't answer. But they tried to stop me.
You're fucking a white male!
They tried to hide the evidence. They tried to demonize any opposition.
Am I saying that I'm better than you? I guess I'm going a little further than you are. Yeah, I'm fucking better than you, okay? Much better than you. You are garbage, okay?
But they failed. Hello, Internet, and welcome. I am your host, Irregulus, and today is the day we tackle the second half of my position of anti-immigration. Or rather, immigration and any numbers that could adversely affect the economic stability of a nation, and in any numbers that could adversely affect the culture of a nation. Yes, I know they are long-winded, much like the title I presented right after such a dramatic intro, but it is important to be specific. Mind you, I doubt that will stop political ideologues from calling me xenophobic or some such nonsense, but at least I can say I tried, right? The layout for this video will be a little less formal than the last. Of course, still being sure to use accurate, if long-winded, explanations on the subject. I was going to start with debunking common emotional arguments put against me, but my rebuttals seemed like hollow assertions without the contents of the study already known. So we will start with the study summary and then move on to the quicker stuff. But first, I found this neat little video that touches upon everything that we are going to talk about, so we will roll the clip.
Migration is changing our world. And Paul Collier, a professor at Oxford University, has written a book called Exodus that tries to tell us how. Professor Collier, you write that most books about migration either try to argue that it's a bad thing or that it's a good thing. You say that's the wrong question. Why?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, the whole topic's been a sort of taboo in social science, except for advocacy. And what I've tried to do is provide people with the analytic building blocks that enable them to think for themselves. The right question isn't, is migration a good thing or a bad thing? Suppose we conclude it's a good thing, which seems to be the sensible conclusion. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean, just because it's good overall, doesn't mean it's good at the margin. The right question is, how much migration?
To allow in the future.
Yes, looking forward. And the reason why we've got to look forward is that one of the building blocks of Exodus is to show that migration, left to itself, accelerates.
Okay, now that's a very interesting and somewhat counterintuitive, controversial point. So explain then, how is it that if policies don't change, migration from poor countries to rich countries will accelerate?
The thing that most helps migration is to have an established diaspora in the country, in the host country, because that established diaspora very considerably lowers the cost of migration from the country of origin. When migration got started, and migration from poor to rich is a pretty recent phenomenon. It only goes back about 60 years. Mm-hmm. When migration started, although the income gap was wide, it was only a trickle because most potential migrants just couldn't afford it. Mm-hmm. Migration has never really attracted the poorest people. It's been the middle-income people in society, and that middle-income group is getting bigger and better off.
Okay, so what do you say are the likely future consequences of accelerated migration?
Right, so migration doesn't necessarily increase diversity. It depends upon how rapidly the migrants are absorbed into society. Mm-hmm. But if migration just keeps accelerating, then at some point diversity does just sort of keep increasing.
So you're talking about cultural diversity rather than skin colour diversity. I mean, the stuff that matters.
Race is of no consequence whatsoever. Anybody from any race can adopt any culture, and lots do.
Yes.
So we've got to be able to distinguish between cultural diversity and racial composition.
Okay, and you're arguing that cultural diversity is rather important, that the reason that...
Cultural diversity is a two-edged sword.
Yes.
And there's a lot of work. Again, this is sort of bog standard in the economics of development now. This is not revolutionary. It's just revolutionary to apply it in the context of migration. Mm-hmm. So we know that some diversity is better than no diversity.
Yes.
Some diversity increases variety of choice. It increases the pace of innovation. But there's diminishing returns to diversity. Mm-hmm. And there are also some increasing costs.
What are
As
they?
you increase diversity, you threaten trust. Loads of evidence that more diverse groups have lower levels of trust. It's harder to cooperate. Again, loads of evidence that cooperation for public goods gets more difficult. Mm-hmm. And finally, a sense of generosity diminishes. A key concept in the book is mutual regard. Mm-hmm. Not mutual respect, which can be quite chilly, mm-hmm. but mutual regard, which is a sense of mutual sympathy, a concept that goes back to Adam Smith. So there's a balance, if you like. Each society has some optimal level of diversity. You want the benefits of variety and innovation, mm-hmm. But you don't want so much diversity that the costs seriously set in. So the right answer to migration, how much migration, is to start from a sense of how much diversity do we want in this society. Mm-hmm. Once you've got that, then the next question is how rapidly are migrants absorbed into mainstream society? For example, the more we favour multiculturalism over assimilation, mm-hmm. the lower will be the rate of migration which is compatible with a given level of diversity.
This is all, I mean, it's a tremendously well-argued, thoroughly researched book. I'm wondering, though, aren't you slightly overplaying the sort of possible future problems that might arise from greater diversity? I mean, you suggest that America and the other societies are totally unlike Europe because they were built on immigration. But I mean, even within Europe, I mean, you look at London, for example, which is by far the most diverse part of England, and yet it's also the richest and really a rather pleasant place to live.
London, of course, is the richest because it's got the world financial sector here. Is London such a great success for the indigenous population? You know, the population of London now is no greater than it was 60 years ago. But more than half of the current population of London wasn't born in Britain. So something rather drastic has happened to the indigenous population in London. It's more than halved. So now that is a dramatic statistic. I can think of no other major city, no other capital city, where the indigenous population has more than halved in half a century. You'd obviously not thought of it that way because you look surprised, but it's it's just an implication of the basic numbers. Let's not over-egg the argument that London's wonderful, so the more migrants the merrier. I know this is the Economist Party line, but
I mean, more broadly though, I mean, you're talking about potential harmful effects that diversity might bring at some point in the future. And it does seem to me that against the, proven very large concrete benefits to migrants themselves and the somewhat smaller benefits both to the societies that receive them and an awful lot of the societies, although not all of the societies that send them, this seems sort of rather theoretical, no?
No, I think, first of all, I think the Economist is a bit gung-ho on migration, right? Liberalise, deregulate, open the doors. It's forgive me, but it's facile, right? That modern societies actually depend upon a load of cooperative games, mm-hmm. which are locally stable, but we know are not globally stable because they don't exist elsewhere. And so all this myriad of cooperation, which actually makes a modern society function, must be somewhat fragile. In the book I give one example is Britain's very rare in having a convention of an unarmed police force. That's a locally stable equilibrium. Police don't use guns, criminals don't use guns, but it's fragile. Very few other societies have that. Now we can envisage immigration which would upset that equilibrium, indeed destroy it.
One can certainly imagine it, yes.
I mean, for example, after the murder of 2 female police officers in London last year, there was indeed the start of a national debate on should we arm police officers. It's stable until it isn't.
Okay. But then the final point there, I mean, what you describe as our facile, gung-ho approach to open borders all the time. I mean, actually, like you, we are making an argument at the margin here. We're pushing against policies which in many rich countries are in favour of screwing the doors more shut than they are at the moment. We're arguing over relatively...
Where we agree is that existing controls are really dumb. Right?
Absolutely.
They don't achieve the legitimate concerns, and they do, in the process, do a lot of damage. So there, we're in agreement. But I think we shouldn't take for granted all the cooperative games that we've managed to put together. After all, in the societies I work on, those cooperative games don't exist. That's why migrants leave them. Am I saying we've had too much immigration? No, I'm not. Right? Am I saying we need a sensible debate to discuss how much diversity our society should end up with? Yeah, we should. I've given people the building blocks on which they can form their own judgment. People who understand the building blocks will reach different judgments. That's fine. That's fine. But we won't be shouting at each other from the basis of prejudice and ignorance, which is what's been happening so far.
Super. Well, I must say I enjoyed the book very much, and I hope lots of people read it. So, Professor Collier, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
The Economist.
That was Paul Collier, a professor at Oxford University, which is also where the study comes from, though I didn't find any direct connection in the study's sources. The reason we started with that clip is I found that it touched on nearly everything we are going to discuss, and it sets a pleasant tone. And if you're looking for more calm discussion on this topic, I think that professor is an excellent, moderate informant. So, to the study. This briefing discusses the meaning, dimensions, measurement, and determinants of social cohesion, drawing on research in the US, UK, and other European countries. It focuses on what we know and don't know about the relationship between immigration, diversity, and social cohesion. Understanding the evidence. There is significant policy concern about the impacts of immigration on social cohesion. However, most research analyzes the relationship between diversity and social cohesion, not between immigration and social cohesion. In theory, diversity can be defined and measured in different ways, by ethnicity, religion, place of birth, nationality, and so on. In practice, most empirical studies define diversity by the racial and ethnic composition of the neighborhood, rather than immigration status, which is typically measured using data on foreign-born or foreign nationals. See the migratory observer, blah, 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 blah. One of the most common measures of diversity is the index of ethnic fractionalization, which measures the probability that two randomly selected individuals, who may or may not be migrants, in a neighborhood belong to the same ethnic group. Data sources typically used in studies of diversity and social cohesion in the UK include the Census for measuring diversity and the Citizenship Survey, which includes a range of questions about attitudes toward the experiences of immigration and integration, as well as other topics relating to the community. There is no universally accepted definition of social cohesion. Although commonly used in policy debates in the UK and other developed democracies, there is no universally accepted definition of social cohesion. Social cohesion is often identified as solidarity and togetherness. Social disorder, or rather social disorganization, is often thought to be the opposite of social cohesion. Frequently, social cohesion is simply defined as solidarity, and somewhat interchangeably used together with the term community cohesion. As is the case with the related concept of social capital, cohesion seems better identifiable through its possible outcomes. Forrest and Kearns provide the following popular summary of the domains of community and social cohesion: common values and a civic culture, social order and social control, social solidarity and reductions in wealth disparities, social networks and social capital, place attachment and identity. Other British policy reports highlight the peaceful coexistence of diverse groups as the heart of social cohesion and identify a cohesive community as one where there is a common vision and a sense of belonging for all communities. The diversity of people's different backgrounds and circumstances are appreciated and positively valued. Those from different backgrounds have similar life opportunities, and strong and positive relationships are being developed between people from different backgrounds in the workplace, in schools, and within neighborhoods. Social cohesion is most commonly measured in terms of trust and common social norms. The lack of a unified definition raises a variety of challenges for the measurement of social cohesion. Most researchers have assumed that high levels of cohesion and social capital in a community will be reflected in high levels of trust between individuals and the observance of common social norms. Therefore, trust and norms are among the most common indicators used in empirical research. Although some studies include traditional measures of social capital, such as membership in associations and political participation, as well as crime and collective efficacy, as in the extent to which neighbors pull together to solve community problems. Some researchers argue that a preoccupation with trust as an outcome seems unjustifiable, since generalized trust is but one of the dimensions of social cohesion and is one of the measures most vulnerable to the effects of diversity. Unlike others such as associational membership. But, as far as I'm concerned, if trust is the most vulnerable to diversity, then right there is a good reason for it to be considered. It is important to note that very few studies measure the actual effect of social contact between neighbors in diverse communities, despite the significance of contact for the establishment and maintenance of a community cohesion. Consequently, the premises of contact theory are not directly tested, namely whether increased contact between people from different ethnic groups decreases prejudice and thus stimulates cooperation. We will see how important it is to account for the role of actual contact in the next section of this briefing. Does increased diversity undermine social cohesion? Evidence from the U.S. suggests a negative relationship. Frequently, the focus in social cohesion studies is on trust, generalized, whether most people can be trusted or neighborhood trust. Most of the neighbors in this community can be trusted. Most of the empirical literature on this subject finds that the relationship between diversity and trust is negative. The more diverse a community is, the less likely individuals in it are to be trusting. The trend seems to hold especially strong for the U.S. Costa and Kahn study they did, established with the General Social Survey that people in more diverse neighborhoods trust their neighbors less and are less likely to be politically or communally involved. Alicina and LaFerrara names found that trust in general and more specifically interpersonal trust is lower in more racially heterogeneous communities in the U.S. Comparing U.S. and Canada observed a strong negative effect of diversity on trust. However, they also found that contact may neutralize but not make this relationship positive. Most notably, Putnam argues that diversity seems to alienate people in general, and in his words pushes them towards hunkering down, as in towards segregation and isolation. Evidence from Europe and the UK is more mixed. Income inequality and deprivation may be more important determinants. Some cross-national comparative research in Europe shows similar results, with trust used as a proxy for cohesiveness. However, the use of trust as the sole predictor of community spirit and togetherness has been severely criticized, since generalized trust is but one of the components of social cohesion. Studies which focus on different dimensions of social capital besides interpersonal trust offer evidence that economic inequality and the democratic patterns in European societies are more important for explaining European countries' different levels of social capital and cohesion. Data from British neighborhoods also do not conform to fieldings from the U.S. Fieldhouse and Cutts comparing the US and the UK suggested that in Britain, diversity has a negative effect on both shared social norms and civic participation, but that these negative effects are offset by the positive effect of co-ethnic concentration. In other words, areas that are more diverse have higher rates of co-ethnic diversity, which in turn, Fieldhouse and Cutt suggest, assist the building of more cohesive communities. Lauren and Heath and Lechty, looking at different predictors of social cohesion in 2005 and 2001 citizenship surveys, argue that there is no strong evidence for an eroding effect of diversity once the association between diversity and economic deprivation is taken into account. Still, with British data based on Citizenship Survey 2005, Lawrence 2009 argue that rising diversity is associated with lower levels of neighborhood trust. So they are asserting that there is no negative effect and that it may indeed be economic disparity that it is causing more issues with trust and social cohesion. But as we covered in part 1 of my position, more immigration is having a negative effect on economic disparity. So that's not really a powerful counterpoint. The studies based on British data such as Lawrence and Heath, Lechty, and Sturgis have raised the question whether it is income inequality, in particular deprivation and impoverishment of an area, rather than diversity per se that serves to estrange people. A sentiment echoed in much of the British policy research and reports based on qualitative, in-depth interviews. Most recently, Sturgis established that neighborhood ethnic diversity in London is positively related to the perceived social cohesion of neighborhood residents with control for economic deprivation. Moreover, it is ethnic segregation within neighborhoods that is associated with lower levels of perceived social cohesion. Both effects are strongly moderated by the age of the respondents, with diversity having a positive effect for the young. So the younger people are more likely to see diversity as a positive, but they still need to adjust for economic deprivation, and they need to adjust for if there is ethnic segregation. I can't pronounce that name. And Biggs, exploring 2011 London riots, find that rioters were more likely to come from economically disadvantaged neighborhoods and neighborhoods where ethnic fractionalization was high. Further exploration of the intersection between ethnicity and disadvantage is thus very pertinent. Some analysts have argued that contact plays an important role in moderating the relationship between diversity and cohesion. With British data based on the Citizenship Survey 2005, Lawrence 2011, argue that rising diversity is associated with lower levels of neighborhood trust, although people with bridging ties, i.e. ties connecting individuals belonging to different minority groups, have less negative experiences. Similarly, Demariva and Heath, using the Managing Cultural Diversity Survey in 2010, administered by the Oxford Diversity Project, and the Ethnic Minority British Election Study 2010, conclude that if anything, diversity should be encouraged to cement the integration process of migrants and foster stronger identification with Britain in the second generation. Heath and Demariva established that high levels of bonding social capital coexist with positive orientations towards integration, high levels of British identity, and low levels of hostility to white people. Lawrence, in 2014, observed that contact moderates the negative effect of community diversity. In other words, for those that have formed ties, diversity has no detrimental effect. This is a result primarily focusing on the white British majority. Importantly, it seems that diversity may undermine local neighborhood social capital, yet has little effect on individuals' total levels of engagement. Thus, individuals in diverse communities have less neighborhood-centric networks, but other active and healthy ones. Datasets such as Understanding Society and the Citizenship Survey allow further examination of the role of contact in different settings, neighborhood, workplace, voluntary associations, and more research is needed in the formation and strength of inter-ethnic contacts. So, it would appear that integration is actually key to eliminating the negative effects of diversity, which, of course, as we will get to, multiculturalism does not encourage. Because, of course, integration would mean that you would have to give up pieces of your original culture. Evidence gaps and limitations. As highlighted at the beginning of this briefing, a key limitation of the available literature remains its focus on diversity and social cohesion, rather than immigration and social cohesion. Communities can become more diverse without immigration, and immigration does not always increase ethnic or racial diversity. It is therefore very difficult to use the available research to make strong claims about the relationship between immigration and social cohesions, since at local authority level there is a strong correlation between previous diversity levels and recent migration. Another limitation relates to disagreements about how to define and what indicators to use to measure social cohesion. Frequently, when a measure other than trust is used, as seen from the literature overview, no negative relationship between cohesion and diversity can be detected, and this is important since the instruments on which the measurement of trust is based in survey analysis are far from perfect. Furthermore, in the last few years, there has been an expansion of the literature on the integration of migration and minorities in Europe that reflects on the possible impact of the multicultural model on patterns of incorporation. There is a growing concern that segregation, allowed through multiculturalism and tolerance of separate parallel lives of minorities and the majority, negatively affects the prospects of migrants to accumulate human capital relevant for successful employment in the receiving society and future employability, such as language fluency. In a similar fashion to the cohesion and trust debate, integration research produces conflicting and mixed results. Koopmans, 2010, claims that multicultural policies which ensure that non-EU 15 immigrants are granted easy access to equal rights do not provide strong incentives for host country language acquisition, labor market participation, and the formation of inter-ethnic contacts. By contrast, Wright and do not find any support for the hypothesis that multiculturalism has undermined the integration of immigrants and minority groups, using data from the European Social Survey and U.S. Community Involvement Democracy Survey. With British data, Understanding Society, Nandy and Platt, 2013, find that minorities express strong British identity with an increase across generations, a strong and positive finding. With German data, from 2012 establishes that bridging ties with majority members allow for better position in the occupational hierarchy of minorities. A common feature of the studies reviewed here is that they focus on a few aspects of integration such as identity or employability, whereas it can be argued that integration is a multidimensional, multi-stage phenomenon that cannot be reduced to one or two outcomes. Thus, considering the complexity of generational change and the rich tapestry of migration, majority and minority experiences in the adaptation process should become a primary focus of research to add depth to otherwise heated debates that are often based on extrapolations and assumptions. Oh, I know that was a long survey, or a long briefing, but I felt it necessary to do the whole thing because I didn't want to pull any punches and I didn't want to be partisan and not go over the limits of the study. So really nothing that is too surprising, I don't think. There have now been a few studies released on this topic, and they are all more or less come to the same conclusion. That diversity has an initial negative impact, growing pains, if you will, and a prolonged negative impact if the new groups aren't integrated, tumors, if you will, as in creating segregated societies. There is a need to have new groups become invested in the culture they moved into to encourage assimilation to some degree. And once interaction and interest is achieved, diversity has no real positive effect. Some people assert that economic disparity is more at fault than immigration or diversity, but as I covered in part 1, immigration is exacerbating the economic issues, so it is a net negative either way. So let's get to how this can be used in the real world of debate. Now, living in Canada as I do means the ideological progressivism is strong and all around. Fortunately, because there is little opposition to them, they are completely defenseless and have nothing but feels to justify their ideals. I present the arguments as best I can. Though you may see the same points with different words, I think that I accurately represent the opposition. First argument. We are a nation of immigrants. This simply isn't true. We are a nation of citizens like any other country, with some new immigrants moving in, hopefully with the intention of becoming Canadians. So no, I am not an immigrant. I am a Canadian. My best friend in grade 2 Gagandeep is also a Canadian. And as I covered in the economic portion, this matters because we are equally impacted and literally taxed by bringing in new immigrants. Point 2. What right do we have to deny immigrants when, quote unquote, we came here en masse and did terrible things to the natives? This is a big one that is kind of confusing if you aren't aware of identity politics, so we'll unbox this. First of all, we have every right. We are a sovereign nation that does not need to heel to other nations or people's desires. Our government also has a responsibility to do best by its citizens, which increased immigration fails to do entirely. So we have every right to deny immigrants. But the last half that seems to always accompany this is a moral judgment based in identity politics, which is absolute cancer. I don't think anyone can say that Imperial Age Britain and France were particularly kind in colonizing Canada. But you are holding people today accountable for the actions of other people in the past, though time doesn't really even matter in this context. You are holding people accountable because they share the same skin color as the individuals that committed these deeds. Now, I may be inclined to be sympathetic to your position if I was substantially dumber and a giant fucking racist, but I'm not, so I don't feel obligated to feel guilty for the actions of others based solely on sharing enough genetic material as to share a similar arbitrary characteristic. Also, because this point just kind of pisses me off, if you can acknowledge that mass immigration and mass cultural invasion, I don't know if I want to use that word per se, but I guess it's accurate enough in this context. If you acknowledge that this event is bad for the current population and then advocate for it to happen again because of white guilt, because two wrongs make a right, because quote unquote we deserve it, well, I mean, maybe China can start eradicating the Japanese for the mistreatment during World War II. I mean, an eye for an eye and all that. So progressive! Number 3. Canadians just need to learn to be more accepting. Well, first of all, I don't think that's possible. We may be the most open culture to have ever existed. Secondly, when we look at a map of the most and least racist countries, we see that the Anglosphere, Scandinavia, and oddly some South American countries are the least racist. This means that, technically speaking, immigration from any of these other countries will inherently make Canadian culture less accepting. How do you like me so far? Number 4. Diversity of people gives us diversity of ideas. This would be a good point if we lived in an age before internet, or mail, or trade, or communication in general. But we live in the world and time that we do, and because of that, ideas can be shared almost instantaneously. This is why when I need to look up how to fix something on my car, there's pretty much an equal chance it will be narrated by someone with a different accent. So there is no need to import people for ideas to still benefit from them. Is there more benefit to having that genius individual in your country? Sure, but if the method to acquire them involves large-scale immigration, it's just not worth it. Also, if this genius is from a country that is behind in development, we would be doing a disservice to that country by taking away that talent. Number 5, and tailing off of that point, some people live in shitty countries. Shouldn't we let them in to make their lives better? Short answer, no. Long answer, we can't adopt the entire third world. As much as you may want to, we can't be the all-mother to millions or billions of people. Partly for ethical reasons, it's not right to treat adults like children, but in a more easily understood way, the majority of immigrants that make it to other countries, or quote-unquote better countries, are the most entrepreneurial, better educated, and generally more energetic, if you want to use that as a general term. These are the people that actually have the potential to lift their native countries up to meet the rest of the developed world. So there's a strong case to make that it is bordering on unethical or immoral to use these people for your own country's interests. And if you're thinking, well, maybe we will bring in the less fortunate people, well, these people are not likely to succeed without formal or education, or literacy even perhaps, let alone marketable skills. So that would lead to a heavier burden on taxpayers. So also you can feel good about yourself. And maybe to you, that is worth the cost, and that's fine. It's not worth it for me. But that's why there has to be a conversation about this instead of dramatic polarization. It almost appears like there's this new moral imperialism, where instead of colonizing and forcing countries to modernize, which maybe wasn't the best idea, We have this new imperialism where we just don't expect these other countries to ever improve on their own, and the West wants to just adopt all of these people instead of leaving them alone to fix their own damn countries, just like the West had to do. And to make the claim that these countries are traumatized by past experiences is pathetic. You have far too overbearing mother attitude if you think that. All history is a list of atrocities that people got over. If it were true that temporary oppression could ruin a country forever, then any conquered group in the Roman Empire wouldn't have become anything important. But somehow, despite hundreds of years of oppression, they put themselves back together and didn't stay in the Dark Ages. Your viewing people as permanently damaged goods is wrong. Your viewing them as defenseless, innocent children is wrong. These people aren't children. Stop treating them like they are. Number 6. Canada is multicultural, so there. Right, but I'm proposed that is a wrong course of action. Canada became multicultural, so to say, because in the beginning there were basically two equal populations of French and English. And even though the English won at the Plains of Abraham, the French were allowed to keep being French, probably because it would have just been too difficult to assimilate that large of a group. But pretty soon the Anglo-Canadians dominated, and now Quebec is really the only province that has French language and some, maybe most of its original French culture. Some provinces around are bilingual in a real sense, but when you cut the shit, Canada is an English country with a French culture colony that has only maintained its language as primarily French from extremely strict language laws. So even in Canada, where we have always been cucks to what people want instead of what is pragmatic, it still requires quite heavy-handed authoritarian measures to maintain even a bilingual, not even polylingual, just bilingual language state. Now, it's important to note that language isn't all there is to culture, and even if Quebec became English-speaking, there would still be things about it that were absolutely French, and that's fine. That is perfectly fine. But the natural course of action is that the cultures combine to some degree when they have to live together. So instead of two distinct cultures, you get one that has elements of both. Where multiculturalism fails is that a country can't have separate cultures operating in the same space without tension. You can't maintain distinctly different cultures within one border without it damaging social cohesion. Well, why? Well, firstly, multiculturalism limits cultures interacting and forming a conversation, which is essential. There needs to be that sharing of ideas and views to either assimilate some groups or to conglomerate into a blended culture, which I think many people think is what multiculturalism will promote, but that notion is false. Multiculturalism wants everybody to maintain their traditions separately and yet live together, as if that won't make an issue. Which is foolish, because cultures are different, and if you want people to get along, they all need to agree to operate with a certain culture or game. Perhaps I'm getting ahead of myself. It is now time to open up the psychology box. From Dr. Jordan Peterson's lectures and from Jean Piaget's theories, we can appropriately explain why a nation needs some sort of monoculture, and certainly some sort of universal justice system. In Piagetian theory, he focuses on children and how they figure out how to navigate in the world and eventually become functional adults, hopefully. And the way this is achieved is by building innumerable schema, as he defined them, or micro-interactions with the world, and they increase in intricacy as you grow up. So, for example, a baby drops something and it falls. They are building a schema with what happens when you drop something. And then mom or dad pick it up, and that's another schema. Anyway, now you're older and you learn things like don't tell this kind of joke in front of these kinds of people. Perhaps a lesson you learned when you were 12 and at a family dinner. Or maybe it's don't bore your YouTube audiences with boring psychology lectures. Well, too bad. This is important stuff. Another way to describe it is to consider these things as games, which is how I can handle with it best, because they have rules and consequences when you are playing correctly or not. Okay, so you develop and you learn these innumerable games with increasing complexity, and suddenly you're a well-socialized adult that can play the game of whatever culture you learned in. So with this culture game, everyone can operate, quote-unquote, correctly with each other because we understand what's acceptable and what's not in our group. Then you throw in another group and they say, well, we play, say, cricket instead of hockey. It isn't inappropriate for the indigenous group to say, well, if you want to live here and operate along with us, you better learn hockey, or we won't know what rules to operate under. Obviously, I'm just using those actual games symbolically. And there is nothing wrong with the dominant culture asserting that it should be maintained. It's the simplest course of action, obviously. Or, if the groups can both agree to talk about it, there can be a blend, if they are allowed that communication. But multiculturalism doesn't like there to be that conversation. It's racist or sexist or some other fucking thing to expect a foreign group to learn the damn game of the country they chose to live in. And if there is a blend, then it's a sin as well, because some parts of either culture is lost, which is unacceptable as far as multiculturalism is concerned. So, instead of making everybody multicultural, it creates pockets of different cultures inside the same country. Because why learn a different game if you don't have to? We see this happening in Europe with the Muslim no-go zones, and we have this in Canada. An Argentinian guy I used to live in Ontario, where he said there was a large enough Hispanic community that you didn't need to know English to live there if you stayed in that culture pocket. Multiculturalism cannot and will not bring people together. It can only encourage exclusion based on cultural identity, which is shutting down the conversations that need to happen, because the word for people you can't talk to is enemy, which is obviously dangerous. The only relationship left if people can't speak as equals and hammer out their differences through dialogue is you're either a tyrant, a slave, or you get executed. And that's all that is left when you don't let people speak and formulate better ideas through conversations. And that's how most of history has been. You either got in line or we kill you. To think that multiculturalism is such an undeniable good so that it couldn't possibly push society in that direction is plainly false. And it's evident in the actions of those that push it as an ideology. For example, the Rotherham cases in England. So, it has its faults, and ignoring them because you feel like it's doing good only allows it to generate more evil. Let people speak, because that's the only option we have to point out evil before it manifests itself in such a way that kills millions of people. #gulags. Sorry I got a bit off topic there, but the threat to free speech coming from ideology is real, and we can't afford to ignore it. Back to topic. This isn't to say that an individual can't be multicultural. It's totally possible to be fluent in many cultures. But it isn't easy because, as I said, it's innumerable small games that you have to at least act out to really fit into another culture. But to expect entire populations to become multicultural is unbelievably naive. And for a country to put legal authority to achieve it is reprehensible. Especially when even the country's laws are altered specifically for certain groups. That is just unbelievable. In part 1, we learned about how people can become alienated from society if it becomes too uneven. And now you want to have real legislation rigging the culture game for certain individuals. A 3-year-old could identify that this game isn't fair, and you think this won't upset anybody. So, diversity is our strength simply isn't true. But if you feel the need to have a catchphrase for what diversity is, then you can start saying, diversity has initial negative effects, but if properly regulated will achieve a value of 0. Or, diversity has growing pains until it becomes worthless. Either is accurate. I just can't stand that stupid catchphrase, especially now that it is undeniably false. So, in conclusion, diversity isn't a strength. It is at best meaningless. Immigration in any number large enough to allow for cultural enclaves is a negative factor for social cohesion, and multiculturalism allows this negative consequence to manifest, and in some instances encourages it. I think a good way to summarize my thoughts on how immigration should be regulated is to put up posters in all immigration buildings. Posters of 2 guys kissing, posters that show a woman in a business suit saying your boss could be a woman in Canada, one with an offensive political cartoon because we have freedom of expression. I want pictures of multiracial couples because your sons or daughters could fall in love with Canadians. I want posters of every liberal thing that we allow in Canada put up all around immigration offices saying, if you don't like what you see, then maybe Canada isn't the place for you. And I love this idea because it will piss off everyone on the edges of the political spectrum. The alt-right will hate that we allow this degeneracy. But they will also not mind the idea of keeping more immigrants away, and the regressives will hate it because it will exclude some people, but it's only excluding the bigots. And if they want to fight that, then they have to admit that some cultures don't fit in with Canadian values. And when everybody's a little mad, that's how you know you really reached the perfect compromise. So there you go. That is my full position on immigration in any numbers large enough to negatively impact the economy or culture. I hope that it was at the very least interesting and informative. I want this to be an open discussion without having to worry about moral grandstanding or emotional arguments geared to guilt you into being silent. This is something that we need to talk about. And I'm only one guy that threw this information together. I don't know what the correct step forwards need to be, but I do know that things are getting worse the way that we are. So we need to change course sooner rather than later. Thanks for listening.